Okay. Okay. So what I would like to really share with you are my thoughts about Yom Haatzmaut, and they're sort of thoughts that have um, consolidated with me over the years um, as we come around and thinking about sovereignty in the Jewish state and what the meaning of it might be for us. But I would like to begin. I want to look at this through some classical sources, through an analysis of a Gemara, which indirectly talks about Hanukkah, and then some Hasidic sources which can enlighten us in terms of when we talk about the state of Israel being a miracle. Like what does that look like, and what lies at the core of that? So let's start. There's a source here. Maybe I'll share my screen to make sure that everybody has the source. Let me just share my screen here, and I'll find the source. Here we are. Okay. All right. So the source that I would like to deal with it. Okay. I hope you see it. Everybody see it? You can go like this if you see it. Yeah, good. Or you can nod your head. That's also good. Okay, so here's a piece of the Talmud. I'll read it in Hebrew and I'll translate it into English. Okay, this is the context of the discussion here is the dispute of when the world was created. Was the world created in the month of Nisan or in the month of Tishrei? And this piece of the Talmud goes according to the opinion that the world was created in the month of Tishrei. And we'll see the context. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages learned. Lefi shera'a Adam Harishon, Yom shemitma'et v'holech, Amar, oy li, shema b'shvil shesarachti olam chashuch ba'adi, v'chozer l'tov vavo, v'zohi mita sheniknesa alai min hashamayim. So we're picking up the story in the middle, where after Adam sinned, he was evicted, of course, from Gan Eden. And because we're holding that the world was created in Tishrei, so the days are getting shorter and shorter. Because, of course, from the summer, from June 21st until December 21st, the days are getting shorter, right? So if the world was created in Tishrei, so we're in the middle of that, so to speak. Right? So the days are getting shorter and shorter. Of course, Adam never experienced this before because this is the first time that it's happening. So he said, what's his response to the cosmic cycle? Amar, oy li, shama b'shvil shesarachti olam chashuch ba'adi v'chozer l'tov avo. This means the end of the world. And the world is coming to darkness and returning to void because of my sin. And that's the meaning of the death which I will be punished with. So these are the ramifications of my sin, that the days are getting shorter and shorter, and ultimately the world will return to total void and darkness. Right? He never experienced anything else. How could he know otherwise? What is his response? Amad v'yashav shmona yamim b'tanit utfila. So he sat and he fasted and he prayed for 8 days. Kevan shera'a tkufat tevet. When he saw the winter solstice, right? V'ra'a yom shema'arich v'holech, and he saw that the days began to get longer again. Amar minhago shel olam hu. No, this was a natural occurrence. I understand that nature is now cyclical, and that the days get shorter and then they get longer, and then they get shorter and then they get longer, right? So he realized that the world was not returning to void, and this wasn't the end of, literally the end of the world. Right? So what is his response? Halach v'asa shmona yamim tovim. So he made an 8-day festival, an 8-day Yom Tov. L'shana acheret, the following years, asa'an la'elu ula'elu yamim tovim. He made both periods of time, the 8-day period that he originally fasted and prayed, and the second 8-day period, which was a time of rejoicing, he commemorated both those periods of time. Hu kva'um l'shem shamayim. He determined those times, those festivals, for the sake of heaven. Ve'heim kva'um l'shem avodat kochavim, referring to the idolaters, made these festivals in the name of idolatrous gods. Okay, that's this piece of Talmud from Tractate Avodah Zarah. Now, one thing which is very important to note here, if you're talking about an 8-day festival in Tishrei and an analogous 8-day festival in Kufat Tevet, which is December 21st, it seems you're talking about Sukkot and Chanukah, even though Sukkot and Chanukah are not mentioned here explicitly. And of course, when we talk about Hanukkah, there's no connection here with the historical events associated with Hanukkah. But what we do have is a festival that's connected with the expansion of light, where things are getting dark and then things start getting light. You have a midwinter festival, which was known in the pagan world, which is what the Talmud is referring to, is that the pagans celebrated this. But this is also the source of a Jewish festival, the Shem Shamayim, of 8 days. So this is the story of Hanukkah before the story of Hanukkah. Okay? In other words, you have layers upon layers of stories. It's not a coincidence that we tell a story of a victory of a few against the many when times are very dark and they look like it's going to be the end after the destruction of the temple, and things just start getting worse and worse. And then there's a turning point, right? The light shines. You see that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and that's what historically, that's what Hanukkah is. So it does tie back to this theme of light in the darkness. Right? It's very interesting. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote a book called The History of Western Philosophy. It was a book of philosophy, you could say, for Balabatim, not for professional philosophers. And he writes there, from his perspective, that were it not for the Maccabees, Christianity never would have come to be. And what he meant by that is that the Jews were on the verge of destruction. After the destruction of the first temple, the Jews were undergoing a process of assimilation into the Greek world, and this would have meant the disappearance of the Jews from the stage of history, and at a time which was before the birth of Christianity. So Christianity would not have been born had the Jews disappeared as a nation 100 years earlier. So it's the Maccabees who reinstilled faith into the Jewish people, both in terms of their religious faith and their sense of historical destiny, that enabled them to survive, so that we could give birth to Christianity. Right? That's Bertrand Russell in the History of Western Philosophy. So even Bertrand Russell sees the Maccabim, the story of the Maccabees, as a turning point. Okay, so that's one thing that's very interesting in terms of this Talmudic piece. There's something else here which I noticed a while back. Let's look at the story of Adam and his reaction to what's happening around him. So it starts off, everything is dark, things are getting darker, and of course, since he's ridden with guilt, he has, it's funny and it's sad. He's very naive. In a sense, there's a tremendous amount of hubris in his naivete. He did a chet, he committed a sin, And he thinks the whole world is going to end because of his sin. So on the one hand, he's taking a tremendous amount of responsibility. On the other hand, it's so naive and so full of hubris that, like, who do you think you are that you do something wrong? The whole world is going to end. But in any case, that's his response. The days are getting shorter and shorter, and he thinks the world is coming to an end. Now, when the days begin to become longer again, what's his response? So he understands minhago shel olamhu, right? That it's just nature. Right? He realizes that's the way the world is. Now, what's really interesting is that when it says the next year, he made both times Yamim Tovim. He commemorated both times and he made them festivals for God. Now, if he just discovered that the days getting longer and the days getting shorter is merely a natural phenomena, why would that lead him to make festivals? If his realization is that it's derech hateva, that it's just natural that the days are getting longer and shorter, then his response should have been, whoa, I was really naive. I thought that the world was coming to an end because I committed this terrible crime, and it's just natural. Well, I'm off the hook. And it should have just been breathing a sigh of relief, and there would be no movement to create festivals to commemorate. To commemorate what? His naivete? His stupidity? He didn't know astronomy, and now he realizes astronomy. So what's the festival? So what's clear here is that the meaning attributed, because you could have looked at what happened and say there's no meaning at all to the days getting longer and the days getting shorter. It's only minhago shel olam. It's only natural phenomena. But what gives it meaning is how Adam interprets the days getting longer and the days getting shorter. So even though he realizes it's a natural phenomena, he still chooses to commemorate the natural phenomena because he's giving it religious meaning. He's giving the fact that he experienced the days getting shorter was not merely a natural phenomena. It was a religious experience for him, which needs commemoration. And when he experiences days getting longer, he experienced being forgiven. He experienced hope. He experienced mission. So that's that he has to commemorate that. So whether what happened is merely his physical phenomena, or it's also religiously meaningful, depends on how Adam relates to it. And if we take that story, and let's talk about it with regards to the Maccabim. So the Maccabim, we say, is miraculous, right? You'll see where I'm going when we're going to talk about the founding of the state of Israel, but I want to put this in a context. So if we talk about the story of the Maccabim, and of course when we say Alanisim, right, we say that there were the few who defeated the many, and we talk about it as a miraculous victory. But the truth is, it could all be explained as something natural, because it makes sense that sometimes that the few will defeat the many. If you have, think about the Americans in Vietnam. The few defeated the many. America was an empire, still is an empire, right? It's a superpower. We don't like calling it an empire, right? It's a superpower. And you had a much smaller country, which technologically was far behind the United States, right? So you have technologically inferior, smaller numbers, but they were victorious. Why was that? Because you had a small group of determined fighters who had no place else to go. They were fighting on their home territory, and those advantages, motivation, desperation, and fighting on your home territory, even against a much more powerful foe, which is far away, it doesn't have the same level of interest in the conflict that you have. So it's very possible that b'derech hateva, in the natural way things go historically, that the smaller numbers will defeat the greater numbers. Think of the American Revolution against the British. It's the same story. The British were an empire. I recommend, if you've ever seen, hopefully we will be out of isolation by the 4th of July, but if you should see the HBO series John Adams, especially I'm thinking the second episode of the Declaration of Independence. And it's clear from there that the Americans are really in a very desperate situation. And it takes a tremendous amount of faith that they will persevere over the British Empire. And what enables them to do it is the fact that there's desperation they're desperate. They have no alternative. And the British are spread thin around the world. And they have other interests. The British don't only have to worry about the Americans, but the Americans only really have to worry about the British. So you have ma'atim neged rabim. You have small numbers against larger numbers. And yes, smaller numbers can defeat larger numbers. And you had a bunch of Maccabim who were very few in number, but they were desperate, and they were true believers, and they were fighting for their homeland. And you had the Roman Empire, and you had not the Roman Empire. You had an empire which was far away, which had interests in Europe and in Africa and in Asia, and the smaller group won. So this can all be explained. What's called derech hateva can all be explained in natural terms. So what's the nace of Chanukah? What is the miracle of Chanukah? And why do we still celebrate it? It's because the people, the sages, interpreted what happened as a sign from God that they must continue, that the Jewish people have to continue, that the Jewish people have to continue living according to the Torah, that there's a mission and there's a common destiny that still needs to be fulfilled. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's how it becomes. So what is miraculous, in a sense, in the story of Chanukah is the fact that what happened energized the people, and that's what caused the military victory, and that's what caused the spiritual victory, because you could win the battle and lose the war, right? You could win the battle against the Greeks and still disappear from the stage of history for other reasons, right? But that battle energized the people. That's, in a sense, that's the meaning of the miracle of Chanukah, that we can still talk about it today. They could have won the war and said, we were really good fighters, and even though the odds were against us, but we had certain advantages which we were able to capitalize on, and we beat the Greeks. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes, the Romans, destroyed the Jews, right? Even though we were maybe more determined, but they were much more powerful. And I guess they had enough determination to put down the rebellion. So it can go both ways, right? And we've known both ways, right? So a lot depends. You can almost say that this Gemara is saying that everything depends upon how we interpret what it is we encounter. Okay? Now, I want to take this idea and I want to show this to you before we begin to talk about Yom Haatzmaut. I want to do this short piece from a book called the Beit Yaakov. It's the first source here. It's written in Rashi print. The book, the Beit Yaakov, he was a Polish Hasidic master, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner. He lived in the second part of the 19th century. Okay, so he has a very interesting interpretation of the sin of Adam from eating from the tree. Okay, And he says, I'm going to try to just take out from here what is absolutely necessary without getting too involved in the text. So he says here, let's see. Towards the end, do you see where I'm pointing? Okay. Ube'emet ra'inu. Does everybody see that? Right? And we see, ube'emet ra'inu, and we see, shelo hichlit HaKadosh Baruch Hu, she'adam harishon achal ma shenitztaveh shelo le'echol. He says, if we read the text of the Bible carefully, we see that God didn't decide that Adam ate from what he was not supposed to eat. God did not decide that. What does he mean by that? He says, ki amar lo rak derech she'ela, hamin ha'etz asher tziviticha levilti echol mimenu achalta. Because he only asks him the question. God doesn't come to Adam with an accusation saying, you ate from the tree. He asks him, did you eat from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? It's a question. Lezem moreh beferush, and that shows, the Beit Yaakov says, and that shows ki bei ba'adam kaima milta, that the answer to that question depends on Adam himself. Lefi sheyitbarer, according to how it shall become clear. V'yuchal liot shelo achal rak hatov v'lo hara, and it could be that Adam only ate from the fruit of good and not from the fruit of evil. What is he saying? This is very counterintuitive to anybody that, of course, knows the story of the Garden of Eden, right? And the story, what's the story that we were taught from even before first grade, right? Is that God told Adam and Eve, right, not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they succumbed to temptation, and they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God confronted them, or Adam, and then he denied it, and then he ultimately comes to terms with it, and he's punished, and he's ejected from Gan Eden, right? And the rest, literally, the rest is history, okay? Now, he's reading the story differently, and on the face of it, it's a very strange way to read the story. He's saying that it wasn't decided. Something happened, but it wasn't decided whether it was a sin or not. And that was left up in the air until, let's see what happens. Let's see if Adam relates to what he did as a sin or not. It's open to Adam's interpretation. And that's why he says God confronts Adam not with an accusation, but with a question. And the answer depends on Adam himself. That's why he says, Ki bei ba'adam kaima milta. It depends on Adam himself. That is a translation of those words. Okay? Now, again, on the face of it, this is like a revolutionary, far-out understanding of the sin of Adam HaRishon. But if you reflect for a minute, I think this is much more true to life. Forget about the story for a second. It's much more true to life. In life, unless we're like really evil or extremely righteous, most of the time we're in a place of uncertainty where something happens and we don't exactly know the meaning of it. We don't know how it's going to play out. We don't know how we should relate to it. We have to wait and see. And then with the benefit of hindsight, you understand the significance of what happened. It could happen in our own personal lives. Sometimes you can realize it the next day, and sometimes it's years later. You look back. I think we all have experiences like this. At least the people I see on the screen are at least my age. So I'm 62. So we've been around for a while. So you look. There are other people here that I can't see at the same time. Some people are younger, but we've all had experiences where, I look back on my life and I say, you know what? That thing that happened 10 years ago, that was a real turning point. But I didn't see it then. Maybe then I was really upset. And then it seemed to me that was really a hard time. And I look back now and I say, you know what? Thank God that happened to me. It was hard at the time, but that was a real turning point. And I turned it around. I did something with it. Or it could go the other way. Something happened. You say, you know what? That was the beginning of the end for me. I can't believe that I went down that path. Right? So you don't really understand what it is when you're in the middle. In the Yiddish, there's a saying, mitten rein, when you're in the middle. So this is actually true, and it should not be surprising from profound Hasidic teachings, that this is much truer to life. What he's trying to read into the story of Adam HaRishon, of the sin of Adam, is that at the time, it wasn't clear how things were going to unfold. And how they would unfold ultimately depends on how Adam relates to what happened. And that's why the encounter with God, and this is very profound, is in the form of a question, not in the form of an accusation. Okay? So everything really does depend upon how we interpret our lives. In the study of Torah, we used to saying you have to interpret the text. But you have to get used to thinking of the idea that you yourself are the text. And it's we ourselves who interpret ourselves and interpret our surroundings. And that's true individually. And that's also true I believe it's also true on a national level. And that's what I think the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which we started with, is saying. Right, that with regards to Adam HaRishon, it depended on his interpretation. And with regards to the Jewish people in Hanukkah, it also depends upon their interpretation of what happened. Because you can interpret things in many, many different ways. Okay? Now let's take a look at a short piece from another Hasidic Sefer, for another Hasidic work. Actually, the father of the Beit Yaakov, which I just quoted, known as the Mea Shiloach, or Mordechai Yosef of Ishbitz. So he has a short piece here, which I believe is very meaningful. He's talking here about the journey of the Jewish people through the desert. Okay? And the Torah, at the end of the book of Bamidbar, of the end of the book of Numbers, goes through the various stations that the Jewish people went through on the journey through the desert. Okay? And of course, a Hasidic interpretation of the journey is that it's not merely a geographical journey from one place to another, from one physical location to another physical location, because that would be trivial. The fact that the Torah chooses to give me the detailed information of where they camped, that means that there's some sort of spiritual interior meaning to those encampments. Okay, that's his assumption, which I think is very reasonable when you come to read the Bible. So now he's looking at the names of the various encampments, and he says as follows: Vayis'u mehar shafer, vayachanu b'charada. So the names of the places are very significant. They departed from Har Shafer, the good mountain, right? All of a sudden it sounds like someplace on the Great Plains in the United States, right? They departed from the good mountain, vayachanu b'charada, and they camped in terror. But you read it like that and you say, what's going on, right? So they departed the good mountain and they camped in terror, or maybe it's anxiety. Okay, we'll see. Hainu, okay. B'chol davar she'adam mesupak ech ritzon Hashem noteh, az ha'etza ha'yeutza lo sheyagdir et atzmo me'ma'aseh v'zeh vayachanu b'charada. Okay, so how does he interpret this? He says, anytime a person experiences uncertainty with regards to what it is that God wants from them, and the truth is, that's most of the time. Because again, the real human experience is not, God told me to do this and I know I have to do this. Right? The real human experience for the person that really wants to live according to the will of God and wants to fulfill their destiny, but the problem is that they don't know what it is. So in any time a person experiences uncertainty regarding what the will of God is, or in which direction the will of God turns, az ha'etza ha'yeutza lo, so then the best advice that you can give is not to do anything, or is to refrain from any actions. Because when you're not sure what to do, the best thing is not to do anything. You need a certain amount of confidence and clarity in order to move forward. When you don't have that, then it would be foolhardy and dangerous to move forward. So sometimes you have to hunker down, right? V'zeh vayachanu b'charada. And that's why the Torah says that they camped in anxiety. Because when ki al yidei charada sheyeh la'adam, tov lo lachanot v'liot sheva al ta'aseh. Because when a person experiences anxiety, it's better for them to hunker down, to camp, and to be encamped and not to do anything and to be passive. And now, see, there's something else which is very important about Hasidic teachings in general, is that they're not primarily interested in interpreting the Torah. What they're really interested in doing is taking their interpretations of the Torah and to apply them to every person that's hearing them and every person that might be reading this interpretation. And now he wants to take it home. And he's taking it home. He's saying, Kimo ata, like today. Now today is Poland in around 1840, just for the record, okay? Kimo ata, shenishbeu shelo yitchaku et haketz. That this is a reference to the Talmud in Tractate Ketubot, that the Jews took an oath not to push the end of days. In other words, to wait patiently for the Messiah, right? So there's a oath which the Jewish people are bound by, right? In all the polemics, the Zionist, anti-Zionist polemics, you know, that religious Zionists have with Satmar and the Torah Karta very often go around these pieces in the Talmud, right? That the Satmar will always say that there were oaths that the Jewish people took not to rebel against the non-Jews, right? So he's referring to that. Kemo ata, like today, namely Poland 1840. Shenishbeu shelo yitchaku et haketz, that the Jewish people took an oath not to push for the end of days. Right? So that is the situation that he viewed himself in. He sees the Jewish people on the journey in the desert, camping in anxiety, and he's saying this is the state of the Jewish people today. This is how he feels. He feels chained to his oath, in anxiety because he doesn't know what to do. The chains are internal, not external. Because he experiencing the anxiety of not knowing what the will of God is, he has no choice but to wait. But then Now he's continuing reading the passages in the Torah. What does it say after Vayachanu b'charada, after they camped in anxiety? It says Vayis'u mecharada, and they departed from anxiety. Vayachanu b'makelot, and they camped in, what's makelot? In great gatherings would be the best way to translate makelot, right? Kahal. Vayis'u mecharada, they departed from anxiety, and they camped in great gatherings. Hainu, right? Because anxiety is when you're all alone, right? Why are we all, why do we want to get together with other people? Because we find comfort with other people. This is a little lesson for our days, right? We're camping in anxiety, everybody by themselves, right? But you can someday leave that anxiety. Vayachanu b'makelot. Hainu, and what's his interpretation of this? Be'et sha'Hashem yitbarach yachpotz l'kabetz otanu, az yitain tkufot b'libam shelo yechridu, l'vai shetiyeh b'karov b'yameinu. He says, when God will desire to gather us in, then he will put confidence in our hearts that we should not fear. What's he saying here? The divine revelation of the coming together of the people is not primarily what happens on the historical, political, military stages of history. The primary movement of the revelation is internal. When the people feel confident, that will be a sign to move. Because it all depends on interpretation. The core of the miracle of the establishment of a state by the Jews, I'm not talking about a Jewish state, but a state by the Jews, is rooted in the fact that after thousands of years, there was a person who had an idea, and that idea caught on, that the Jews should take their fate into their own hands. And yes, it's dangerous, and there are terrible risks, and there are economic risks, and of course there are military risks. It's a terribly dangerous endeavor, but maybe partially out of desperation, out of courage, out of looking at European society in the 1870s and the 1880s with the growth of enlightened nationalism and the nation state. All those things together painted a certain portrait which people interpreted, and that portrait impacted upon the way they thought about the world. That was a divine revelation. And the fact that that portrait and that interpretation moved masses of people to create a Jewish state, that is the revelation of Yom Haatzmaut. Of course, you could say there are secondary revelations. There's, of course, a military victory. That depends how we interpret it. There's political victories. There are economic victories. And there aren't only victories, right? And there are certainly challenges. But the core of the revelation is the shift in consciousness of the people. That's where it begins. That's where it happened with the Maccabim. That's where it happened with Adam HaRishon. And that's also why the Vietnamese beat the Americans. And it's also why the Americans beat the British. Because it starts with the consciousness of the people and how we interpret it. And we interpret that shift of consciousness as a divine revelation, and that makes us move. Okay? I just want to go through one or two other sources which point to this, and this is very important in general when we think about the consciousness of people in the Jewish state, okay? And particularly religious consciousness. I want to talk to what's called the religious community in Israel in terms of the attitudes that we have. Okay? A lot of people speak for Torah, and there are a lot of differences of opinions of where things should be. I just want to relate to, first of all, this short piece from the Me'orei Naim. The Me'orei Naim was Rav Nachum Chernobyl, who was a disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich. He was an early disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich, and he knew the Baal Shem Tov personally. So we're talking the end of the 18th century. So he says as follows. Maybe I have it, I translated it, so I'll just read I'll read the English, and if you prefer the Hebrew, you can see the Hebrew here, okay? We see that there are numerous people who study the Torah and perform evil deeds. The Torah is referred to as a mirror, aspaklaria. As a person is themselves, so they perceive in the mirror. So it is with the Torah. If the person is base and mixed with good and evil, that is how he perceives the Torah. Therefore, a person needs to purify himself so that his baseness should not interfere with the seeing of the divine light of the Torah. He's saying that what the Torah is a function of human interpretation. And there's no such thing as tabula rasa. There's no such thing as a person being totally objective and seeing reality the way it is. That is a bubba maisa that we tell ourselves. The truth is that we perceive things according to who we are. And when we meet external stimuli, whether it's the world that we're interpreting or the Torah that we're interpreting, we interpret it in our image. So an evil person will see evil things in the Torah. So you get these terrible things which are pronounced in the name of the Torah, because they don't have an awareness that it all depends on interpretation. Whether it's a miracle or not depends on how you interpret it. Whether creation is a miracle or not depends on how you interpret it. And how you relate to the state depends on how you interpret it. And how you relate to the Torah depends on how you interpret it. And it really comes back to questions of character and who it is that you are, that you bring to the table to what you interpret. And I just want to finish with this short piece from the Mea Shiloach, which has to do with how we relate to redemption. And he's talking to how Moses related to the exodus from Egypt. And it's also a very surprising piece. Okay, but again, I think very true to life, though. Vayihi b'shalach Paro. Okay, when Paro sent the people forth from Egypt. Hine, ka'asher ra'ah Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom. When Moses saw, ki af achar sheyig'alu, od Paro holech achareihem lelavotam. When he saw that even after the people departed from Egypt, Paro still was pursuing them. Right? So that's very surprising, because after everything, after the 10 plagues, Moses must have thought that we're finally leaving and this is it, right? Why it says, "Vayihi be'etzem hayom hazeh," right? In this very day, they left. But then he turned around, and Paro is still pursuing them. So this you don't get from the story of the Torah exactly, right? But what's Moses's response to that? So he has a very interesting reading. Allah b'da'ato safek. pen adayin lo nishlemu Yisrael b'tachlit hashleimut. V'al yidei zeh yesh od shayachut leFaro imahem. He all of a sudden was gripped by uncertainty. Moshe, in the middle of Yitziat Mitzrayim, in the middle of the Exodus, which we just passed Leila Seder, in a sense, you could say there's no clearer moment in Jewish history or in Jewish religious history. There's no clearer moment of revelation and of redemption. And the middle of this, Moshe is ridden by doubt. It's like, think of it this way. It could be a funny way to think about it. Is Moshe Charlton Heston or is Moshe Woody Allen? Right? So we used to thinking like the 6'5" guy, right? Charlton and Moshe Rabbeinu leading the people out like this, right? But the picture that he's painting here of Moshe is a much more of a Woody Allen type of character, excuse me, right? Where he's not sure, right? Allah b'dato safek. Pen adayin lo nishlemu Yisrael b'shleimut, b'tachlit hashleimut. Maybe he misunderstood something. Maybe the Jews aren't ready to go out. And that's why Paro can still pursue them. Because external realities are reflections of internal realities. If the Jews were internally free of Paro, then Paro on the military plane would not have been able to pursue them. It's only because Paro senses a connection that the people still have with him that he can gather up the muster to pursue them. And the truth is, if you look at the story of the Jews in the desert, it is a good close reading, because whenever things go wrong, the people say, let's go back to Egypt. Egypt was no honeymoon, but it's the only home they knew, and they were still connected. And this is something that Paro senses, that the people are still connected. As much as he abused them, the people are still connected to him. I'm tempted, but I'm not going to make political parallels to today, whether to Israel or the United States. I'm holding myself back, okay? But despite the fact that Paro abused them, they're still connected to him. And that's what gives Paro the power to pursue them. And Moshe intuits this. And he's thinking, well, the people are not ready to be free. It's one thing to take them out of Egypt physically, but they can only be free inside if they can free themselves. And they're not. So Moshe is ridden by doubt. Upen hu machmat, and why is that? Shahayu zman rav b'Mitzrayim, because they were in Egypt for too long. Lachein yesh lo tzad shayachut imahem, and that's why Paro still has some sort of lean over them, some sort of influence over them. He has his claws sort of embedded in their consciousness because they were there for too long. And then there was something else also. The Gamer Oto ki lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim pen yinachem ha'am. Gam mizeh hevin ki od lo nishlemu b'tachlit haberur. And the fact is, everybody knows the shortest way to get from Egypt to the land of Canaan, and that's the coastal road. But God, you have to be crazy to go into the desert. So God takes them into the desert. Why? Because it says, because if the people feel threatened by war, they'll go back to Egypt. So Moshe Rabbeinu sees that there's a danger, people are going to go back to Egypt, and Paro is chasing them. So the redemption is not going according to the way Moshe expected. He had a certain interpretation in his mind, which now the unfolding of the text of reality was no longer fit his interpretation. So when we realize that the reality is fashioned by our interpretation, whether it's the interpretation of Adam HaRishon as a model, or the interpretation of the Maccabim, or our own interpretation of what happens around us nationally and in our private lives, when we realize that so much depends on our interpretation and in constructing our reality, that has to lead to humility. Because every interpretation, by its nature, is tentative. Because maybe something else will happen. We'll discover a new text, so to speak. There'll be another piece of data which will necessitate me to reinterpret. That's what an interpretive tradition is. You're always reinterpreting. You never come to a final interpretation. That means that alongside the realization that miracles are interpretations, and that's what gives them ultimate meaning, comes humility and the understanding that everything you say is, in Hebrew you say be'eravon mugbal, limited liability, so to speak. You hope that it's good enough to go on, but you're always aware that you're never 100% sure. And I think that on the one hand, we gain perspective when we look back at modern Zionist history, say the last 150 years, right? We can say that there was a major shift, historical shift, first of all in the consciousness of the people, which led to momentous historical events. But at the same time, when we're in it, and we're still in it, and we're in it now in present tense, we have to be very careful not to read reality through eyes of certainty and hubris, but we have to know what it is we know and what it is we don't know, and hope that we can do the best that we can, not from a place of hubris, but a place of faith. So I think the real nace, the real miracle of Yom Haatzmaut is that the people were actually able to be moved internally by a vision of taking our fate into our own hands, and you could say entering the stage of history. But the stage of history is still full of uncertainty, and we have to, in a sense, embrace that uncertainty, because that's where we ultimately grow. That's where we encounter ourselves, and that's where we encounter God, through how we interpret the reality. Okay. All right, I'm gonna unshare my screen right now. 1 second. And I'm gonna take a look at if there's any questions that came in from the chat. Okay. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now, I will unmute, and if people have any questions, we'll try to do it like one by one. Okay, you're unmuted. Let's start by, if anybody has a question, raise your hand and I'll call on you. This way it won't be everybody speaking at once. Anybody have any questions or comments? Who's that? Joe?
No, I was very intriguing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I can stick something that I read recently, if you want, that with the Dreyfus affair, like, it was the whole, I mean, everybody knows about it, but it was at the end of it where actually it sort of spoke to Har'el.
Right.
And you would have no idea what it went there and what it would turn into.
That's right. That moved him, and we could read that today as a form of divine revelation.
Right.
The fact that moved so many people.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So is that it? Any questions, comments? All right. It was a real pleasure. Everybody should have a meaningful Yom HaZikaron. We should remember the people that fell, so that we could actually even have this Zoom conversation, and that we could enjoy freedom. We should have a Yom Haatzmaut Sameach. And next year we should all be outside in the parks doing our mangalim, right? But I'm just gonna have to do a mangal in my front yard. I'm very privileged. I'm happy I have a front yard to do that in. I don't have to do it, light a barbecue in my living room. That could be dangerous. And all right, so Chag